and welcome to our lecture over colonial art in Mexico and Peru. So we've already looked at this artwork to help set up Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire. However, now let's look at it for under colonial Mexico and how, remember, by 1521, the Spaniards had essentially taken over this empire. Unfortunately, many indigenous Americans, North, Central, and South America, had died from disease. Yes, by guns and by warfare, but like we talked about with the Aztec lecture, is they just didn't have any of the immunity against smallpox, etc., which really wiped through the population. And so by 1521, where essentially the Spanish conquest, it's the Spanish conquest of 1521. They've established their rule. And so we have this concept of the viceroy. And so this is a person who's appointed to rule a country as the deputy of the sovereign. In this case, in modern-day Mexico, we're looking at Antonio Mendoza, and he was established as the viceroy of this region under Emperor Charles V of Spain. And he commissions this artwork, the frontispiece of the Codex Mendoza. So technically it's a colonial Mexico piece, but it was made by Aztec artists. They realized after burning every single record that existed that the Aztecs had created, that then suddenly they wanted to retain, or at least create a textbook of some of their history. Now, it never made it to Spain. It was actually seized by pirates, and it was brought to France, where it was later sold. But this was about 20 years after the conquest of the New World. And it was actually done, like I said, by these native scribes, but under the supervision of missionary priests. And they added in these Spanish annotations that we see. We have the Aztec glyphs versus the Spanish annotations. The first section of notes copied several works that were created before the Spanish conquest, and then they were destroyed. It really describes this detailed history of Tenochtitlan and the history of present-day Mexico City. It includes information about its founding rulers, including the last ruler, Moctezuma. And the second section has a summary of the tributes given by these 33 provinces that sent their tributes to the capital of the Aztec Empire. And then the last section details the everyday life of these native Aztecs, basically from birth until death. And so it's almost like a textbook of the Aztecs, in which the Spanish had unfortunately conquered and decimated by disease. There were many codex that were created during this time period. Here are some other ones. Some focus on the destruction of the native population. Others tried to copy much of the native artworks, the indigenous artworks. Okay, so let's talk about Miguel Gonzalez, the Virgin of Guadalupe. So we are pretty familiar with this imagery, being from Texas, luckily. I'm sure you've seen this imagery. And so we are more familiar with it. You also have that assigned video over it. But let's talk about what the history of it. So this work was made by one of the best known painters of these shell inlay paintings, these encontrados. Now, here's where we get into the colonial era, being this mix of essentially different cultures across the globe. So we have these major powers. We have Spain, we have Britain, we have the Portuguese, who have traveled across the globe. And so these ideas, as well as these artworks and these goods, are making their way into other parts of the globe. So what do I mean by that? So this shell inlay creates this luminescent work here. Excuse me, light. All these little shells. And those actually come over from more of our Southeast Asia influence. So this idea of incorporating this shell work into art had been used within Southeast Asia. And so now, and as well as East Asia, but especially Southeast. And so the shell inlay was already popular, and these ideas are taken over into Mexico, where then they start to create these shell inlay artworks. So here's our example of this globalism. We think that globalism is relatively new, but really, I mean, we're looking at an artwork from 1698 CE where we're already seeing indications of this. And so, yeah, here's our shell inlay. It creates this luminescent quality. You can imagine how it shifts and changes in the light, etc. All right, so let's talk about this story. So this is the legend of Juan Diego, and in 1531, he was on this hill, this hill called Tip. Okay, he was a Indigenous American, and he was near this shrine to this pre-modern or pre-colonialism, pre-Columbian goddess. And in 1531, he was up atop this hill. Whenever the legend is that the Virgin Mary, Jesus' son, revealed herself to him atop this hill. And she spoke to him in his native tongue. And she made the hilltop flowers bloom. And Juan Diego gathered up these bloomed flowers and put them in, like, he takes the cloth that he's wearing, this like shawl, and he scoops up these flowers as proof that he saw the Virgin Mary. And he brings them down and shows them to, like, the bishop here, the archbishop. He held this bundle of flowers in his cloak, and when he dropped these flowers, he opened up his cloak, and the flowers dropped on the ground in front of the archbishop, and there on his cloak was the image of the Virgin Mary. Further proof of this miraculous event that occurred. And so the Virgin of the Guadalupe is showing this miraculous event. So we have these roundels that surround the Virgin Mary describing this story. So this is one of the most revered symbols in Mexico. She becomes the patroness of New Spain. Okay. Now she always is going to stand on this crescent moon. Let's go into some of the details. So with the sun rays behind her, this cloud, the moon is also under her, or the crescent moon's always under her feet. And that comes from Revelations 12:1, the last book in the Bible. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Sometimes we see those stars, but just note that we're pulling from this imagery in the Bible. And so this image becomes extremely popular. There's this miracle that occurred. And so many were made for exporting across the globe. And so still today, the Virgin of Guadalupe is really popular. So I remember, like I was talking about, where I had one of these foremost experts, a professor during my undergrad, and she explained how when we come back to our Aztec mythology that we discussed, and we talked about Coatlicue and how she's this mother goddess. And she's ultimately one of the most important goddesses. It's from her that Huitzilopochtli even came from. So she's the most revered. So consider how there's already this importance on a mother goddess. Then we have this miraculous event of another mother, essentially a mother of a god, of Jesus, who is shown to an indigenous, Juan Diego, an indigenous individual, and in his native tongue. And so there's this connection, this transference of this idea of the importance of the mother goddess can now be done with the Virgin of Guadalupe, where this makes sense, where it's familiar, where the same ideas and concepts and this this reverence for this mother goddess can be seen with the Virgin of Guadalupe. So that's one of the main reasons of why this imagery became so popular and was so embraced by the indigenous population, because it was familiar. It's like the goddess Coatlicue, of this mother goddess, giving birth to Huitzilopochtli, the most important figure, the patron deity of the Aztecs, whereas here we have the Virgin Mary, who's given birth to Jesus, the most important figure and founder of Christianity. So you can see where these stories, the similarity, would help this idea to spread so much, because it's familiar. The surrounding frame here is original to this artwork, and it is arguably more Baroque. So we have these elements coming through. I'm seeing now that I have a discrepancy with my date. Sorry, 1698. I don't know where my 16th century came from. Anyway, and so there is the Virgin of Guadalupe. So now when you see that imagery, if you weren't familiar with the story already, now you are. Okay, so let's talk about the Spaniard and Indian produced mestizo as part of our Costa paintings. This is attributed to Juan Rodriguez Juarez. If we're looking just from a formal analysis, we're somewhat in this more Baroque style. We're early 18th century, so we're just coming out of the Baroque from the previous century with our not quite tenebrism, but the lack of a background, a little bit of our dramatic lighting. But these Costa paintings, here's a different version. These Costa paintings were made, they were patronized by the Spaniards in Mexico. And so they typically comprise of 16 scenes. And these are representations of family groups. And what it's seen as is this idea of a new caste system being developed. So the idea of the caste system stems from India. It's been around for about 3,000 years. It was made illegal in the 1900s, but unfortunately in some areas it's still really practiced. And it's this idea of this social hierarchy. We'll talk about this when we get to South Asian, but it's this hierarchy in which you're designated to your social class for life and all future lives, that you're reborn into it unless you do what you're supposed to do in that life and you help to build up this good karma to move up into new social classes in the next life. I'm very much generalizing here. We'll go into this in another unit. But it's also primarily based on skin color, and that the higher in the caste system, and these are from ancient texts, like I said, at least 3,000 years where this was established in India, where the lighter the skin color, the higher up in the caste system, and the darker the skin color, the lower in the caste system you are. And so we're pulling this idea of this designated, and I quotation marks, social hierarchy as if you were doing a scientific study of a social hierarchy. And so they're creating this caste system within Mexico, these Costa paintings. And so in this case, the idea is the dilution of this pure Spanish blood, with the lighter skinned Spaniards being at the top. And then they've categorized the mixing of different bloods between like the Spaniards and the natives. And as well as there were about 200,000 West African slaves brought into Mexico too. So if we're coming to one of the evils of history, the transatlantic slave trade, we have America, about 307,000. Cuba, you may be familiar with, Jamaica, and then the Caribbean, 2.7 million. Brazil creates a similar caste system under the Portuguese with 3.1 million. But we have about 200,000 West African slaves that are shipped to Mexico. And so, like other images, like I didn't go into this with our portrayal of Moctezuma, but these were made as quotation marks of this scientific study of native populations and shipped out to Europe to show these natives as well as this new caste system that's being developed. And so with these ones, it's this, let's talk about with this Spaniard and Indian produced a mestizo, in which the mestizo is the product of a gentleman marrying an indigenous woman. And so they designate these different names to describe different cultural backgrounds mixing together. And so it's this unfortunate designation of these social classes. Spaniards and a mulatta, so in which the Spanish are trying to create this whole caste system in which they're sending out for this European interest of seeing these new people, this ethnic mixing across the globe, particularly back into Europe. And so you have these 16 different gradations on the social scale. Now, they usually show these families as these happy families. Arguably, we could see where some arguments are made that, they're seen in this Christian family setting. And then what they've also done is that they've portrayed the indigenous with more European features, where they're considered the nose, etc. And that was intentional. The slim noses or these almond-shaped eyes. So they're adding this European lens. Okay, so here's Esiel Timerde, master of the La Paz school. So we're heading into Peru. And this artwork, if we look at we're in our 17th century, and so we're actually more in the Baroque period. So this is arguably Baroque. It has Baroque elements. Consider our tenebrism, our lack of a background. Of course, we're very geographically removed, and so there's going to be some differences. Now, I want you to think back to the Council of Trent, okay, the part of our Counter-Reformation, and where the Spanish make these decisions, changes to the church, or they really designate specific theology and rules, etc. And so they also are discussing about art. Now, as part of the Council of Trent, they decided that any depictions of angels, okay, are not to be done except unless you're trying to portray Michael, Gabriel, okay? So these archangels that are part of Christianity. But otherwise, you're not to depict any angels. This was essentially a ban on the depiction of any normal angels. So this painting is in direct violation. The Spanish art Catholics is in a direct violation of this new Spanish doctrine that's been produced. But they're so geographically far away from Spain that they're not going to feel the repercussions of this. And so here we have this angel. And so the angel is, now I'm looking at my notes, this is by the master of the La Paz school, but the angel is supposed to be shown as like this, he fears God. Esiel Timorde means fears God. And so what we see is this combination of celestial elements, military elements, and aristocratic symbols to show this being that represents the triumph of Catholicism over the native religions of the New World. Okay, that this angel has helped conquer the native population. He's in his finest clothing, contemporary dressed of this Spanish aristocrats, but he's an angel, and we know that because of the wings. Now look at the depictions of the wings. This isn't like other angelic depictions of these fluffy wings that once the Council of Trent came about were outlawed. We weren't allowed to depict these angels. Instead, we have these more native looking wings. Consider how we've discussed, or you've seen how feathers are an important element within the indigenous culture here. And so they're pulling these indigenous elements in the study of these feathers. And the portrayal of a gun, of an angel holding a gun, was also would have been extremely frowned upon by the Spanish in Spain. That's the arquebus is the type of gun here, to show an angel with this contemporary gun. This gun was first created in the 15th century. It's able to be, you push it into your shoulder, had accurate aim. And so this image of these angels were definitely illegal, but they're showing the conquering of the indigenous by these Spanish within Peru. And so we have the development also of art schools here that are being created. We have the La Paz school. Also note with the use of feathers, how feathers were particularly important for those higher up on the social hierarchy of the indigenous cultures. And so we're showing these very meticulously drawn feathers on an angel who's high up there, celestial being, so high up on the hierarchy. Okay. There's also the use of gold elements and this incredible fabric. So we're seeing our elements of depicting different textures being instituted within these schools in Central America. the screen with the Siege of Belgrade and hunting scene. You'll watch that video over this artwork. This one I've added to your handout. I forgot to add it this year. And here's our portrait of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz by Miguel Cabrera. So, trying to end on a more positive note. So this is a depiction of Sor Juana Inés, Sister Juana Agnes. So we talked about how females during this time period essentially were married, or the select few who didn't want to do that became nuns. And so here we have Sor Juana Inés. She becomes this literary figure. She's depicted in her library. She's a member of the Hermits of St. Jerome Nuns in Mexico City. And what she has done and what she's known for is that she helps to institute schools for all children. And her passion is to make sure that they have access to an education. And what's especially unique is she makes sure that girls equally have access to this education. And so she's this heroic figure, and so we have a depiction of her almost 100 years later. Well, sorry, she became a nun later on, 1669, so not quite 100, and celebrating her mark on history of trying to help equal access for all to education. And so we have our established art schools here. We have our depiction of different textures, etc. One unique item that is particular to colonial Mexico is this escudo. It's this framed painting worn below the neck, and it's really only seen in these colonial Spanish paintings. And we have this Christian imagery depicted here with the Virgin Mary before the angel, likely the Annunciation. And yeah, so here's one of she's seen as this literary figure. She wrote poetry, but her crusade for equal access to education for all children of different social classes and genders is pretty remarkable for the time period. She even opened up a school. Okay. And there's the end of our lecture.